Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your testimony. Just on the LIBOR point, when the chairman of the Fed was here the other day, he talked about the possibility of moving toward a more market-based alternative to LIBOR, and you'd mentioned to Senator Menendez, maybe we should be thinking about that. What would those alternatives look like? And I think the point he was making was that rather than having a rate that's sort of voluntarily reported by a small set of banks, you might actually find yourself in a place where you could have rates that were stress tested by the market so that we could really have confidence in what we were getting. So could you tell us a little more?
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the dominant questions before the council and the people looking at this question is exactly what would be a better alternative and what transaction-based rate would better serve the broader interests of the market. There are other parts of the financial markets where they rely on survey-based estimates, and they do that for very practical reasons. And doing that doesn't necessarily make it vulnerable to the types of incentives to misreport that you saw in this case. But you have to design the safeguards around that very, very carefully so it's not vulnerable to that. But of course, we'll look at all those options, and we'll be happy to brief this committee as the thinking evolves in that.
I think we'd like to hear about that. I mean, I think there are probably some situations where the market is lagging or transactions aren't actually happening, and you can see why in that circumstance you might not have a market rate that would work, but it would seem that there ought to be one that could replace LIBOR. That'd be very interesting to me. Robert Samuelson had a piece in the Washington Post this week called "The $12 Trillion Misunderstanding," and in this piece he accounts for how we got from a projected budget surplus of $5.6 trillion that was made in 2001 to where we are, which is $6.1 trillion, an $11.7 trillion swing, he says. And he goes through and he says, this is how we got here. The biggest cause of it was the recession itself, which was about 27%. If you add up the recession and the tax cuts from the early 2000s, you're at 40%. If you add up the Iraq and Afghanistan war, you're at 10%. That's 50% of where we are. Increases in defense spending 5%, the Obama stimulus 6%, and so on and so forth until he gets to 100%. And his conclusion is, so most theories, often partisan, of the $11.7 trillion shift turn out to be wrong, exaggerated, or misleading. There were lots of causes. No single cause dominates. And I think I'd like to enter that article in the record, Mr. Chairman, with your permission. I think he very clearly lays out the comprehensive nature of how we created this problem and the reason why we're going to need, as you have testified, a comprehensive solution to get out of this problem. So as we think about coming to the end of the year here, it seems to me maybe there are four alternatives to what we face. We could go over the cliff. And when I say we're going over the cliff, it's not the United States Congress. We're driving the American people over the cliff if we don't do something. That's one option. So we could let the sequester go into effect, the tax cuts expire. We could do as we've done for a long time and continue to kick the can down the road and just say, well, we didn't really mean it. When we put this tough sequester in place, we didn't really mean it, so we're going to turn around and just lift it or extend the tax cuts. We could solve the problem in a comprehensive way during the lame duck session, or we could put some process in place to try to get us to a solution in the new year. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, first of all, are those the only alternatives? Maybe there's something I haven't thought about. And second, how the financial markets would respond to those, or maybe what would be the most reassuring thing we could do for the American people at the end of the day, not to repeat the travesty of the debt ceiling discussion last summer.
Well, I agree that if Congress were to choose to try to defer everything, tax cuts, tax expiry, and sequester, and do nothing about the long-term fiscal position and nothing to help growth in the short term, that would be very damaging to the interests of the country. And I think to say that as a nation we have no capacity to come together on a set of reforms to address these problems and have to go, as you use your phrase, go off the cliff, seems deeply irresponsible. So I think the solution to this problem has to lie in, and there's been a lot of foundation laying by you and others and your colleagues in this direction over the last year in particular. The solution has to lie in replacing those expiring tax cuts for middle-class Americans and the sequester with a balanced mix of reforms that'll raise a modest amount of revenue and lock in some carefully designed savings to make our commitments to seniors more affordable over time and still preserve some room to invest in things necessary for us to grow. That is the way this has to be resolved. And if we were to do that as a country, that would be good for confidence and good for the economy, good for certainty, and it would demonstrate again what the world has always believed about this country, which is ultimately we come together and do the necessary thing. We don't wait till it's too late.
I think, Mr. Chairman, I apologize because I know that my light is red, but I've been here for the whole hearing, so I'll just ask one follow-up question. And I've learned so much, so it's been good. One follow-up question to that is, and I don't believe there's enough of this around this place, but at home, people do have a sense that we're all in this together, that we have to come together and fix this together. And at least in Colorado, they really are sick of the partisanship in this place on this topic. Could you give us, in that spirit, a sense of what the scale we would be asking ourselves to commit to versus what they have to do in Europe, for example? And what we'd be asking our generation to do to secure the future for the next generation as a relative matter, what the people in these other countries are going to have to face.
Excellent question. Let me just try and do it very briefly. To get our deficits down to a level where the debt stops growing as a share of the economy, we need to do it on top of the $1 trillion of savings Congress enacted last year. We have to agree on roughly $3 trillion, at least $3 trillion of additional savings. That seems like a lot to people, but it's only about 2% of the national output income this economy creates. It's roughly 2% of GDP. And that is a very manageable challenge for a country like us. And if you do it carefully, with sensible reforms on the tax side and carefully designed savings on the spending side, you can do it without causing any damage to the growth prospects of the U.S. economy and to the basic confidence and security retirees have, or people have for health care, even the basic safety net for low-income Americans. The challenges faced by every other major industrial economy in the world, from Japan to Europe, are vastly greater because their growth potential is weaker, their populations are much older, the size of their governments are dramatically larger, the generosity of their commitments are much higher. So our challenges, although they feel daunting to us and can't be deferred forever, are completely within our capacity to act, again, without asking Americans or the business community or the retirees to accept an unacceptable basic burden in that context. And that's why it should be within our capacity to solve. You know, we can't control what Europe does. It has big effects on us, but they're not within our capacity to control. These things are completely within our capacity to control, and they're completely within the ability of this body to come together on and agree on some sensible reforms.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.